Welcome everybody to our channel. In 1995, Nelson Sakaguchi, the manager of the Brazilian bank Noroeste, was interested in making a major investment. He received a message from Nigeria, which discussed the state's desire to build a new airport in the capital, Abuja, and that they were looking for investors to finance the project. He then received a call from a man who claimed to be the governor of the Central Bank of Nigeria, saying that the cost of the project was estimated at $250 million, and that investment in it was available entirely to Noroeste Bank. Also, they were also offering the opportunity to invest in this project to other investors, as it was a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. This increased the interest of the Brazilian bank manager, and he began to think seriously about it. Because building an airport in a large city would be a surefire investment, and since Abuja is one of the largest cities in Nigeria with a large population, building an airport there would be a profitable project. This all meant that it was a truly valuable and irreplaceable opportunity. While he was thinking, the caller interrupted him and told him that if he agreed to invest in building the airport, they would give him a commission of $10 million as a reward for being the intermediary that would lead to the completion of the deal. After hearing this, his enthusiasm increased, and he began to see that the offer was very tempting and could not be missed. After some thought and discussion, the Brazilian bank manager agreed to the offer and said that their bank would take the project and they would begin the necessary procedures. But actually, the person who called the manager of Noroeste Bank in Brazil did not have any project to build an airport. He was not even the manager of the Central Bank of Nigeria. He was a man named Emmanuel Nwude, the manager of a private commercial bank called the Nigerian Union Bank. This was a scam. Emmanuel had planned this massive fraud in a very clever way. First, he gathered 4 other experts in financial and banking systems, who had worked in banks before. They knew the important people in the financial sector of the state very well. They then formed a group of 5 people and began to implement the fraud. They took advantage of the fact that the Nigerian government had recently moved the capital to Abuja in 1991, and that the government was undertaking several projects to develop it. They exploited this by writing letters in a formal and polished manner, stating that the Nigerian Ministry of Aviation was looking for investors to build an airport in the new capital of the country, Abuja. They then put in the name of the sender as Terry Williams, who held a senior position in the government, namely the position of Director of the Planning and Budget Department in the Nigerian Ministry of Aviation. Of course, this person was a figment of their imagination and did not exist in reality. Thanks to their strong ties in the financial sector in Nigeria, they were able to use a government fax machine to send these letters to several banks around the world. The letters were customized according to the bank and the country to which they were sent. Thus, when Nelson Sakaguchi received the letter and saw that it was sent from the Nigerian Ministry of, and because their bank was looking for investment opportunities in developing countries, he immediately believed the letter and saw the project as a great opportunity for them. He then sent a fax reply to the letter, stating that his bank was interested in the project. Then, Emmanuel Nwude and his gang received the letter. Emmanuel Nwude then impersonated the identity of the central bank governor and called Nelson Sakaguchi. They had a conversation as I mentioned to you earlier. After Sakaguchi was completely convinced of the project, he asked for a suitable place to meet to discuss the matter and finalize the agreement. He suggested either coming to Nigeria or them coming to Brazil. Emmanuel replied that they wanted to keep the project secret and not announce it until it began to be implemented. Therefore, they had to meet in a place far from Brazil and Nigeria. He told him that he could choose the place he wanted. Sakaguchi agreed and said that he would be in London next week for some business, and they could meet there. Emmanuel agreed to this. After that, he and his team began to prepare for the meeting. Each one of them impersonated an important person. Emmanuel Nwude impersonated the central bank governor. The team also included the wife of one of them. Then, they forged the documents they needed and prepared a plan for the airport and the land on which it would be built. This was all to make it seem real and so that Sakaguchi would not suspect anything. The day of the meeting came, and Emmanuel and his gang traveled to London. They stayed at a 5-star hotel. When Sakaguchi arrived, they booked him the most luxurious suite. When they met him, each one introduced himself as the character he was impersonating. Sakaguchi did not suspect anything. Then, Emmanuel showed him the forged plans for the airport and the land. He then told him that the project would begin to be implemented after 5 or 4 years, and that they did not want to announce it until it began to be implemented. Sakaguchi agreed to this and told him that there was no problem with that, and that their bank would be ready to finance it at any time the project began. Emmanuel interrupted him and said that the financing must begin now, not until the start of the project. This is because they currently only have the initial plans, and the project requires many things, such as providing materials, contracting with partners, and many other preparations that must be done before the start of the project. After this speech, Sakaguchi began to have doubts about the matter. He seemed tense and worried. Emmanuel interrupted his thinking and said that if he was not comfortable with the matter, it was not a problem, because there were many investors waiting to meet with them for this project, and that he was the first person to respond to them, and that he had expressed his enthusiasm for the idea. He also said that they would give him a commission of $10 million as a reward for his efforts in completing the deal, and that if he was not comfortable with the matter, it was okay, because everyone wanted this opportunity. After Sakaguchi heard this, he felt afraid that he would lose this opportunity, and with it the $10 million. He said that even if he agreed to the matter, the bank's management might not agree. Emmanuel replied that this was his problem, and that if his bank did not agree to invest in this project, there were many other investors who would. Sakaguchi replied that he had agreed, and that he would take care of the matter with the bank. From here, Sakaguchi officially fell into the trap. After that, they agreed that Noroeste Bank would invest $242 million, which is a very large amount. Then, Emmanuel told Sakaguchi that he had to pay $3 million as a deposit, otherwise the deal would not go through. Sakaguchi agreed and paid that deposit. After this meeting, Sakaguchi began to transfer money to Emmanuel continuously for 3 years, from 1995 to 1998, without the bank's management knowing anything, because Sakaguchi was careful about that. He always transferred amounts that did not exceed $6 million because he was the bank manager and responsible for foreign transfers, and he had the authority to make any transfer that did not exceed $6 million. If the transfer was worth more than $6 million, he had to obtain the approval of the bank's management. In order not to raise suspicions, he would transfer the money to different accounts around the world. Therefore, no one in the bank's management was paying attention to what was happening, as Sakaguchi was also responsible for tracking the money. As for Emmanuel and his gang, they were using 17 different banks in Nigeria to receive and deposit the money in order to avoid raising suspicions. This was facilitated by the weak financial oversight in Nigeria and the ease and abundance of bribes. Emmanuel would also send documents, plans, and pictures continuously so that Sakaguchi would think that the work and preparations for building the airport were going well. However, the truth that Sakaguchi did not know was that Emmanuel and his gang had invested the money for themselves. They bought palaces and houses, purchased stocks, and made several other investments for themselves. They continued in this way without being discovered, until something big happened that turned the tables. One day, Noroeste Bank received an offer from Spain's largest bank, Santander, to buy and acquire it. The owners of Noroeste Bank initially agreed to the offer, so each bank formed a committee to study all of Noroeste Bank's assets and properties in order to assess its value. After conducting these studies, they were surprised to find that a third of the bank's capital was missing. Nelson Sakaguchi, the bank's manager, was immediately summoned and asked to explain. He had no choice but to confess everything. He admitted that he had entered into a huge deal with the Nigerian government worth $242 million to build an airport in the capital, Abuja. He said that he had been transferring money to the group with whom he had entered into the deal without anyone's knowledge for the past 3 years. After that confession, the bank's owners were shocked and could not believe what they had heard. Immediately after that, a committee was formed to investigate and track the money trail. After a lot of effort and investigation, they were finally able to trace the network in countries through which the money was transferred. They found that they all led to Nigeria, but they could not identify the identity of those people due to the lack of good financial oversight in Nigeria. After a long period of pressure from Western banks, especially Swiss banks, Nigerian banks were forced to cooperate in revealing the identities of those people. Swiss and other Western banks conducted several investigations and then closed several accounts that they found had been used to transfer the money. They then forced Nigerian banks to assist in revealing the true identities of the account holders. Nigerian banks agreed to this, fearing that their accounts would be closed in Swiss banks. After the investigations, the true identities of the account holders were discovered, and they were able to reach Emmanuel Nwude and his partners. However, they were not arrested and remained free to roam Nigeria freely. This is because there were no penalties for fraud and financial scams in Nigeria at the time. The acquisition deal between Santander Bank of Spain and Noroeste Bank of Brazil was then completed. The bank was sold for much less than the value that its owners had expected, due to the losses the bank had suffered as a result of the fraud. Nelson Sakaguchi was also arrested and tried in Switzerland on charges of financial fraud and money laundering. He he was sentenced to several years in prison. Then, the owners of Noroeste Bank hired lawyers in different countries around the world to try to recover sums of money they had lost. But to no avail, because all the money was located in Nigeria. As I told you earlier, there were no penalties for fraud or financial scams in Nigeria at the time. The situation continued in this way without the owners of the bank recovering anything, until Nigeria had a new president, who saw that cases of fraud and embezzlement had increased significantly in Nigeria. Therefore, in 2003, he formed a body to combat these crimes, called the Financial Crimes Commission. In 2004, this body opened an investigation into the case of Emmanuel Nwude, and then arrested him and his gang, except for one of them, who died in a traffic accident during the investigation. Anyway, after Emmanuel and his gang were arrested, their trial began in Abuja. During the trial, the judge warned Emmanuel not to try to bribe anyone in the court. Despite this, the trial did not go well, because many of the jurors and court officials in the courtroom seemed to have been bribed. Therefore, the judge could not trust anyone and felt that things had gotten out of his control completely. The trial was suspended and transferred to Lagos, Nigeria's former capital and largest city. After the trial was transferred there, Emmanuel tried again to bribe a number of officials, including the head of the Financial Crimes Commission, but he was unsuccessful. An attempt to bribe charge was added to his charges. During the trial, an order was issued to evacuate the place due to the presence of a bomb. The trial was stopped and everyone left the courtroom. Special forces arrived and searched the place, but found nothing, and it turned out to be a false alarm. Many believe that Emmanuel was behind it, but there is no evidence to prove it. The trial was then resumed, and Emmanuel was asked to return the money. So, he said he would return $10 million, but the court refused and asked him to return $80 million. He refused and said he would not return more than $40 million. The prosecutor replied that this was his last chance, and if he did not return $80 million, he would regret it. But Emmanuel refused and remained adamant on the $40 million. Then, the court brought a witness who changed the course of the case and put Emmanuel in real trouble. The witness was the man who had been the victim of the fraud. Yes, it was Nelson Sakaguchi. When Emmanuel saw him, he knew he is in big trouble. After that, Sakaguchi admitted that Emmanuel had impersonated the governor of the Central Bank of Nigeria and had defrauded him of $242 million. He then told all the details that had taken place between him and Emmanuel and his gang, and presented copies of the documents that Emmanuel had sent him, which proved his story. This proved the charge against Emmanuel Nwude. Emmanuel realized the difficulty of the situation he was in, and said that he would return $80 million. The prosecutor replied that that opportunity had been lost, and that he was now obliged to return $120 million to the owners, and pay a $10 million fine. Emmanuel agreed to this because he had no other choice, and he was sentenced to 5 years in prison. After he was imprisoned, he was released after serving less than 2 years in prison. After he was released from prison, he filed lawsuits against the government, claiming that they had taken from him assets worth more than $120 million, and that the assets they had taken were already in his possession before he committed the fraud. He actually won those cases, and he was able to recover about $50 million. Now, this is the end of the story. We hope you enjoyed your time with us. Write for us your opinions in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like the video, and share it with your friends.